This video talks about solving quadratic equations, and it looks at the simplest problems, those that we can solve by finding the square root. And the first thing I want to do is I want you to look at some different quadratic equations, and here are 6 of them. And I want you to notice it, 5 of them, and I want you to notice that 3 of them are fairly easy and 2 of them are going to be more difficult, and think about why. Well, let's look at this first problem here. If we notice this first problem here, there's an x squared, but there's no x, right? And on the second one, the same thing. Here we actually have 2 x squared terms, but there's no x term, and the third one as well. So on all of these first 3, what we have is we have an x squared term. In some cases we have 2 of them, but no x term. Another way to think about that is if your equation is ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, then b is equal to 0. That's another way to think about it. Harder problems are going to be where you have an x squared term and an x term, in this case or this case. And in that case, those are going to be more complicated, and we'll have a different way to solve it. But let's deal with the simple problems first. So let's look at an example. We'll look at the first example we looked at. 3x squared plus 18 is equal to 48. So if b is equal to 0, that's the way you want to think about it. Or if there's an x squared term but no x term, then there's only 2 steps. The first step is you isolate the x squared term, and then simplify, and the second step is you simplify by finding the square root. And there's something you never forget when you find the square root, and the thing that you never forget is you never forget your plus or minus. So let's write that down. Don't forget the plus minus. So the very first thing we want to do here is we want to, in fact sometimes what I'll do is I'll take a red pen and for the x squared term I'll circle it. And we want to isolate that. So the first thing we do, this is a plus 18, so we want to subtract 18 from both sides. And we get 3x squared is equal to 30. At this point, you can either multiply by 1/3 or divide by 3. It doesn't matter which one. And you get x squared is equal to 10. And that's the end of step 1. So one way to think about it is this is step 1. And now let's do step 2. You have x squared equals 10. The opposite of a square is a square root, so you can take the square root of both sides. And the thing that you never forget when you take the square root of both sides is your plus or minus. So here, this is your answer. Your answer is going to be x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 10. We have 2 answers. They're real solutions. And that's how you do that problem. Let's do a somewhat more difficult problem. Let's do 2x squared plus 45 is equal to, let's do 4x squared plus 20. Now let's do plus 31. So again, the reason this is easy is because b is equal to 0. Or another way to say that is because there's an x squared term but no x term. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get the x squareds on one side and the numbers on the other. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 45, and then I get 2x squared is equal to 4x squared. 31 minus 45 is going to be a minus 14. So now I'm going to get the 4x squared over here. I'm going to subtract 4x squared and subtract 4x squared. So I get minus 2x squared is equal to minus 14. Now I'm going to either multiply by -1/2 or divide by minus 2. And I get x squared is equal to 7. That's the end of step 1, and step 2 is simply to take the square root of both sides. X squared is equal to square root of 7, and don't forget your plus or minus. And let's look at one more problem. Let's do 5x squared minus 10 is equal to 3x squared plus, so let's do 70. Again, I notice that this is a fairly easy problem because there's an x squared and no x. When there's an x squared and no x, in other words, when b is equal to 0, then you simply isolate the x squared and then take the square root. So just two simple steps. And in this case, what I want to do is let me get the 3x squared over there. And then that's going to be 2x squared minus 10 is equal to 70. I'm going to add 10 to both sides. And then I have 2x squared is equal to 80. Divided by 2, you have x squared is equal to 40. And take the square roots. You have x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 40. I still need to simplify. Now, if you need help with simplifying, there's a video that just says simplify square roots. And you can watch that and review that. The basic idea is the way that you simplify square root of 40 is you find two numbers that multiply to 40, but one has to be a perfect square. So that's going to be 4 and 10. So that square root of 4, square root of 10, so your final answer, square root of 4 is 2, so your final answer is 2 square root of 10. And that's how you do it. Now I have a little mnemonic device to help me remember this. I call these Squebftsr problems. You don't have to, but that's the way I'm going to refer to them. Because what we're doing here is we're solving quadratic equations. And the question is how are we solving them? We're solving them by finding the square root. So rather than going through this each time, I just call it solving quadratic equations by finding the square root. And that's how you solve quadratic equations when there's an x squared term but no x term.